The massive glass dome of the Galactic Council chambers stretched high above the assembled delegates. Thousands of different species sat in their designated sections, each area designed to accommodate their unique biological needs. The Altarians floated in their liquid-filled pods, their tentacles dancing through the water as they communicated through bioluminescent patterns. The reptilian Corvani lounged on heated stone platforms, their scales catching the artificial sunlight that streamed through the dome. In the center of it all, the towering figure of Chairman Zekthor dominated the main podium, his crystalline body refracting light in a display meant to intimidate lesser species. Ambassador Kate Morrison stood at the human delegation podium, her simple blue uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by other species. She was 45 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and intelligent brown eyes that had witnessed too many of these political theater performances. Behind her sat the rest of the human diplomatic team, 12 individuals, who had spent the last 5 years trying to make their voices heard in this vast assembly of alien politics. The morning session had been typical. The Vrillan hegemony had proposed new taxation on smaller member worlds. The Centaurian Commerce Guild had lobbied for exclusive mining rights in the Outer Spiral. The Corvani Defense Fleet had requested additional funding for their patrol ships. Through it all, whenever a human representative tried to speak, they were either ignored or given dismissive nods before the conversation moved on to more important matters. Kate checked her chronometer one last time. In exactly 30 minutes, every human ship in Council space would begin their departure sequence. The evacuation had been planned for months, carried out in absolute secrecy. Not a single alien official suspected what was coming. She cleared her throat and activated her podium's amplification system. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. "The United Earth Federation formally withdraws from the Galactic Council, effective immediately." The chamber's background chatter continued for several seconds before the meaning of her words registered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The Altarians' bioluminescent communication patterns flickered in confusion. Several smaller species turned in their seats to stare at the human section. Chairman Zekthor barely glanced up from the data tablet. He was reviewing. His voice resonated with harmonic overtones that his species used to convey authority. "Very well, Ambassador Morrison. Your species was never truly suited for galactic politics anyway. Too emotional. Too unpredictable for proper governance." A ripple of agreement passed through several delegations. The Vrillan representative made a sound that translated as dismissive laughter. The Corvani admiral's tongue flicked out in what his species considered an expression of mild amusement. None of them seemed particularly concerned about losing humanity's participation in their grand political experiment. Kate continued as if she had not heard the comments. "We thank you for the educational experience these past 5 years have provided. The human race has learned much about galactic civilization during our membership." "I am certain you have," Zekthor replied, his tone carrying the same condescension he might use when speaking to a child. "Perhaps in a few centuries, when your species has matured sufficiently, you might consider reapplying for membership." More laughter echoed through the chamber. The Centaurian trade delegate leaned over to whisper something to his Altarian counterpart, causing the floating creature's tentacles to writhe in what passed for amusement among his people. On the observation deck above the main floor, Captain Jake Sullivan watched the proceedings through the reinforced transparent aluminum windows. He commanded the UES Liberty, a diplomatic escort vessel that had spent the last 5 years ferrying human representatives to various council meetings and ceremonies. The ship was modestly sized compared to the massive battle cruisers that other species used for similar purposes, but it was efficient and reliable. Jake was 38 years old, a career military officer who had volunteered for diplomatic duty because he believed in the importance of humanity's place among the stars. His dark hair was cropped short in military fashion, and his green eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen combat and understood its true costs. He wore the standard blue and gray uniform of the Earth Fleet, with the simple rank insignia that marked him as a captain. Beside him stood his communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Carter, a young woman in her late 20s whose expertise in xenolinguistics had made her invaluable during diplomatic missions. Her blonde hair was braided in the practical style preferred by shipboard personnel, and her hazel eyes were focused intently on the scene below. "Sir?" Amy whispered. "Are you certain about the timing? Every human facility in Council space is supposed to begin evacuation in 27 minutes. Jake nodded without taking his eyes off Ambassador Morrison. "The coordination has been perfect so far. 347 colonies, research stations, mining operations, and diplomatic posts across 18 sectors. Not one of them has raised any alarms." Below them, Kate was concluding her brief remarks. "The human delegation wishes all council members success in their future endeavors. We harbor no ill will toward any species represented here today." Chairman Zekthor made a gesture that served as his species equivalent of a dismissive wave. "Your departure will cause minimal disruption to council operations. The sectors you occupied can be redistributed among species better equipped to utilize them productively." The Vrillan representative stood to address the chamber. "Perhaps this withdrawal will serve as an example to other immature species who seek membership before they are ready. The council standards exist for good reasons." Kate gathered her papers with deliberate precision and placed them in her diplomatic case. The other members of the human delegation rose from their seats in perfect synchronization. There was no hurried movement, no sign of distress or anger. They simply stood, collected their materials, and prepared to leave. Ambassador Morrison called out the Corvani military advisor, his reptilian voice carrying a note of curiosity. "What does humanity plan to do now? Your species lacks the industrial capacity for true independence." Kate paused at the edge of her delegation's seating area and turned back toward the main podium. For a moment, her diplomatic mask slipped, and something else showed in her expression. It was not anger or frustration, but something closer to pity. "We plan to be busy," she said simply. The human delegation filed out of the chamber in orderly fashion. Their footsteps echoed hollowly on the polished floor, the only sound in a space that had suddenly grown quiet. As the doors sealed behind them, conversations gradually resumed among the remaining delegates. Captain Jake Sullivan and Lieutenant Amy Carter made their way quickly to the Liberty's docking port. Throughout the massive space station that housed the council chambers, human personnel were completing their own departures. The evacuation was proceeding exactly as planned. 26 minutes later, as the council session moved on to a debate about agricultural subsidies for the Outer Rim territories, the first human ships began disappearing from council space. 6 months had passed since the humans vanished from council space, and Dr. Veltara found herself staring at research data that made no sense. The Altarian scientist floated in her laboratory pod, her tentacles moving through the nutrient-rich fluid in agitated patterns that would have alarmed any member of her species who witnessed them. The bioluminescent patches along her elongated body pulsed with frustrated orange and red hues. For the past 3 years, her medical research team had been making breakthrough discoveries at an unprecedented rate. New treatments for genetic disorders had emerged monthly. Surgical techniques that had seemed impossible were becoming routine procedures. The advancement in biological sciences had been so rapid that other species throughout the galaxy were sending their brightest minds to study under Altarian guidance. But now everything had stopped. The research projects that had been progressing smoothly were hitting dead ends. Experimental procedures that had shown promise were failing during clinical trials. The innovative approaches that had revolutionized their understanding of xenobiology were no longer producing results. Veltara activated her communication device and contacted her research partner on the neighboring space station. Dr. Hullnex appeared on the holographic display, his own tentacles showing similar patterns of distress. "Have you reviewed the Henderson protocol files?" Veltara asked, referring to a series of medical procedures that had been developed through collaborative research. "I have been trying to understand them for weeks," Hullnex replied. "The theoretical framework is brilliant, but without the supporting documentation, I cannot replicate the results. The human researchers who developed these techniques took all their notes when they departed." Feltara's chromatophores shifted to deep purple, indicating profound concern. It is worse than missing documentation. I am beginning to suspect that the human contributions to our research were far more significant than we realized. 3 sectors away, Trade Commissioner Hulvin was discovering similar problems in the commercial networks that connected thousands of worlds across Council space. The Centaurian official stood in the central hub of the largest cargo processing facility in the galaxy, watching displays that showed shipping delays growing longer each day. The facility had once processed over 10 million tons of cargo daily, with clockwork precision. Supply routes that connected the farthest reaches of known space operated with efficiency that other galactic civilizations envied. Raw materials flowed from mining worlds to manufacturing centers. Finished goods moved from production facilities to consumer markets. The economic engine of the Council had hummed along without significant disruption for decades. Now that engine was beginning to sputter. Cargo ships arrived at wrong destinations. Loading schedules that had once been synchronized across multiple star systems were falling apart. The sophisticated logistics algorithms that had managed interstellar commerce were producing increasingly erratic results. Hulvin activated his personal communicator and contacted the head of shipping operations, a fellow Centaurian named Zekval, who had been managing cargo flows for over 20 years. The situation is becoming critical, Zekval reported. Delivery times have increased by an average of 40% across all major trade routes. Customer satisfaction ratings are dropping to levels we have not seen since the commercial wars. What is causing these delays? Hulvin asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. The optimization systems that controlled our supply chains were designed by human consultants, Zekval admitted reluctantly. We assumed their work was purely technical, but it appears their understanding of logistics was more sophisticated than we credited them for. Hulvin's scaled skin shifted to a darker shade, a sign of growing worry among his species. How sophisticated? They were not just writing software. They were thinking 3 steps ahead of every other species in ways we did not recognize. The efficiency improvements we attributed to better technology were actually the result of human strategic planning. In the military sectors of Council space, similar realizations were dawning on officers who had spent years dismissing human tactical contributions as crude and simplistic. Admiral Thexara of the Corvani Defense Fleet stood in the command center of her flagship, reviewing after-action reports from recent anti-piracy operations that had gone disastrously wrong. The Corvani were a warrior species with a military tradition spanning thousands of years. Their tactical doctrines had been refined through countless conflicts across the galaxy. They prided themselves on their strategic thinking and their ability to adapt to new forms of warfare. The idea that humans, with their brief history of spaceflight, could teach them anything about combat had seemed absurd, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Pirate raids that had once been easily repelled were now succeeding with alarming frequency. Enemy forces that should have been outmaneuvered by standard Corvani tactics were instead outflanking Council fleets and escaping with minimal losses. The sophisticated defense networks that protected major trade routes were proving inadequate against increasingly bold criminal organizations. Admiral Thexara activated her personal files and accessed the tactical manuals that had been left behind by the human military advisors. She had never bothered to read them thoroughly before, dismissing them as the work of a species too young to understand real warfare. Now she found herself studying documents that revealed layers of strategic thinking she had not recognized. The humans had not simply been offering suggestions during joint training exercises. They had been quietly revolutionizing Council military doctrine in ways that became apparent only after their departure. The tactical innovations that Council officers had assumed were their own discoveries had actually originated from human strategic analysis. Meanwhile, reports were filtering in from the Outer Rim territories about strange encounters that defied easy explanation. Merchant captains spoke of unidentified vessels appearing during pirate attacks, driving off the raiders with weapons technology that seemed decades ahead of anything currently available. The ships appeared to be human in design, but they incorporated systems that no human technology should have been capable of producing. Captain Velsek of the independent freighter Dawn's Promise had filed one such report after his ship was attacked by slavers near the frontier worlds. His crew had been preparing for capture when unknown vessels appeared and eliminated the slave ship in seconds, using energy weapons of unprecedented power. The rescue ships identified themselves as human, Velsek had told the Council investigators, but their technology was unlike anything humans possessed when they were Council members. Their ships moved with precision that suggested artificial intelligence far beyond our current capabilities. Similar reports were accumulating from across the galaxy. Human ships, or vessels that appeared to be human, were intervening in conflicts throughout the outer territories. They protected refugee convoys, defended mining operations from raiders, and provided humanitarian aid to disaster-stricken worlds. But they did so using technology that suggested humanity had undergone dramatic advancement during their brief absence from galactic civilization. The economic impact of humanity's departure was becoming impossible to ignore. Human entertainment had generated massive revenue streams throughout Council space. Their literature, music, and visual arts had created cultural movements that influenced dozens of species. Human restaurants and cultural centers had become gathering places where different species could interact in neutral environments. Now those venues stood empty. The cultural exchange that had enriched Council civilization was gone. The unique human perspective on art, philosophy, and social interaction had vanished, leaving a void that other species were unable to fill. Dr. Veltara floated in her laboratory, reviewing the data one more time, and finally understood the terrible truth. Humanity had not been junior partners in Council civilization. They had been the hidden architects of its greatest achievements. 2 years had passed since humanity vanished from Council space, and Admiral Thexara stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the empty void where the human colony of New Haven should have been. The Corvani Defense Fleet had spent months organizing this deep space reconnaissance mission, using their most advanced sensor arrays and fastest ships to track down the missing human settlements. What they found was nothing. The star system that had once hosted a thriving colony of 2 million humans showed no signs of recent habitation. Orbital platforms that had processed raw materials from the system's asteroid belt were gone without a trace. The massive hydroponic stations that had supplied food to a dozen neighboring worlds had vanished completely. Even the navigation beacons that had guided ships through the system's complex gravitational fields had been removed with surgical precision. Commander Velkoth, the fleet's chief science officer, approached Admiral Thexara with his latest sensor readings. His reptilian features showed the confusion that his species rarely displayed in front of subordinates. "Admiral, the scans are complete," he reported. "There is no debris field, no residual energy signatures, no indication of how such massive installations could have been relocated. The humans did not simply abandon this system, they transported everything." Admiral Thexara's tongue flicked out in the gesture her species used when processing disturbing information. What kind of technology would be required for such an operation? Based on our current understanding of physics, it should be impossible. The energy requirements alone would exceed the output of most stellar reactors. Yet the evidence suggests they moved entire space stations and industrial complexes without leaving a single trace. This was the 15th human system the fleet had investigated, and the pattern was always the same: complete evacuation with no indication of where the populations had relocated. The humans had not simply left Council space. They had vanished from the known galaxy as if they had never existed. On the research station orbiting Altair Prime, Dr. Veltara was experiencing her own desperate search through the files left behind by her former human colleagues. Her laboratory had become a monument to frustrated scientific inquiry, filled with half-completed experiments and theoretical frameworks that she could no longer advance without human expertise. She had been particularly close with Dr. Alan Cooper, a human xenobiologist, whose insights into genetic engineering had revolutionized their understanding of biological systems. Alan had been working on synthetic biology projects that promised to eliminate disease and extend lifespan for every species in the Council. His research notes were meticulous and detailed, but they revealed a mind that thought in ways fundamentally different from any alien scientist. Dr. Veltara activated her communication system and contacted her research assistant, a young Altarian named Sulvera, who had been helping her analyze the human research data. "Have you made any progress with the Cooper Protocol documents?" she asked. "I have been studying them for weeks," Sulvera replied, her chromatophores displaying patterns of deep frustration. "The theoretical foundation is brilliant, but Dr. Cooper was working from assumptions about biological systems that our science does not support. Either he was completely wrong about fundamental principles or human understanding of biology has advanced far beyond our current knowledge." "What kind of assumptions?" Dr. Veltara asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "He writes about consciousness as if it were a transferable property. His notes suggest that human researchers had developed methods for backing up and preserving individual minds. The genetic modification techniques he describes would require the ability to rewrite DNA at the quantum level. According to our physics, such precision should be impossible with current technology." Dr. Veltara's bioluminescent patches dimmed to nearly black. "What if our physics are incomplete? What if the humans discovered principles that we have not yet understood?" Meanwhile, in the communication networks that connected the Council worlds, mysterious dead zones were appearing with increasing frequency. Captain Rachel Adams had been the human engineer responsible for developing the faster-than-light communication protocols that allowed instant contact across thousands of light years. Her work had seemed straightforward to the alien technicians who maintained the systems, but her departure was revealing the true sophistication of her designs. Chief Communications Officer Zeknul of the Vrillan hegemony stood in the central hub of the galaxy's primary communication relay, watching displays that showed growing areas of network failure. Messages that should have taken seconds to transmit were experiencing delays of hours or days. Entire sectors were becoming unreachable as the communication grid developed gaps that technicians could not repair. The human engineer was not simply improving our existing systems, Zeknul reported to his supervisors. She was rebuilding them from the foundation using principles we do not understand. Without her ongoing maintenance, the network is collapsing back to its previous limitations. The economic consequences were becoming catastrophic. Trade agreements that depended on real-time communication were falling apart. Military coordination between different species was becoming impossible as message delays grew longer. The unified command structure that held the Council together was fragmenting as worlds lost contact with central authority. But perhaps the most disturbing discoveries were coming from intelligence reports that filtered in from the edges of known space. Scout ships were detecting massive construction projects in uncharted regions of the galaxy, operations on a scale that dwarfed anything in Council history. Captain Ben Walker of the independent survey vessel Star Wanderer had filed reports about artificial structures larger than small moons appearing in previously empty space. The construction appeared to be proceeding at impossible speeds, with complex installations being completed in weeks, rather than the decades such projects should require. "The building techniques are unlike anything we have seen," Captain Walker reported to Council intelligence. "They are not assembling components in the traditional manner. The structures appear to be growing, as if they are being manufactured at the molecular level through some form of advanced nanotechnology." Even more troubling were the defense systems protecting these construction sites. Any ship that approached within a certain distance would find its sensors blocked by interference fields that made detailed scanning impossible. The few vessels that had attempted closer investigation had been politely but firmly turned away by unidentified craft using technology that seemed decades ahead of current Council capabilities. Trade Commissioner Hulvin reviewed the intelligence reports in his private office, his scaled skin shifting through colors that indicated profound concern. The economic data was painting a picture that challenged everything the Council thought they knew about human civilization. During their membership in the Council, humans had seemed to be struggling economically. Their industrial output had been modest compared to established species. Their technological development had appeared to lag behind galactic standards. Their resource extraction operations had seemed inefficient by Council measures. But the intelligence report suggested that human industrial capacity had undergone explosive growth since their departure. The construction projects being observed in deep space would require manufacturing capabilities that exceeded the combined output of the entire Council. The speed of development implied access to resources and energy sources that should not exist. Dr. Veltara floated in her laboratory pod, reviewing the final research notes that Dr. Alan Cooper had left behind. Hidden in the technical documentation was a personal message that he had apparently intended for her to find. Dear Veltara, the message read, by the time you read this, you will have discovered that human science has been developing along different paths than Council research. We learned much during our time among your people, but we also brought knowledge that your species are not yet ready to understand. Do not feel discouraged by your current limitations. Every species develops at its own pace. When you are ready, we will be happy to share what we have learned. The message was signed simply Your Friend Alan, but it contained technical specifications that suggested human biotechnology had advanced to levels that bordered on the miraculous. As she studied the documents, Dr. Veltara began to realize that humanity had not been learning from Council civilization during their membership. They had been teaching it, so subtly that no one had noticed until they were gone. 3 years after humanity's departure from Council space, the peaceful agricultural world of Kethvar became the center of galactic attention for all the wrong reasons. The planet housed 3 billion Vreelan colonists who had spent generations transforming the world into a paradise of crystal gardens and floating cities. The inhabitants lived in harmony with their environment, their crystalline bodies drawing energy directly from the planet's unique mineral formations. The attack came without warning. The Devourers emerged from the darkness between stars like a plague of locusts, their biomechanical ships swarming around Kethvar in numbers that blocked out the sun. This nomadic species had terrorized the outer rim for centuries, consuming entire biospheres and leaving dead worlds in their wake. Their ships were grown rather than built, living vessels that could adapt to any defense and regenerate from almost any damage. Governor Yelkoth watched in horror from the planetary command center as the first wave of Devourer landing craft descended toward his world's surface. The planetary defense grid, one of the most advanced in Council space, lasted exactly 43 minutes before being overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacking vessels. Send emergency signals to all Council fleets, he ordered his communications officer. Request immediate military assistance. The reply came within minutes from Admiral Thexera, whose Corvani defense fleet was the closest military force capable of mounting a meaningful response to the invasion. Governor Yelkoth, we are 3 days' travel from your position at maximum speed. Hold your positions and protect civilian populations until we arrive. 3 days was far too long. The Devourers moved with the efficiency of a species that had perfected the art of planetary consumption over millennia. Their biomechanical warriors were already overwhelming the local defense forces, while their harvesting machines began converting the planet's crystal formations into raw materials for their fleet. Yelkoth stood at the command center's main display screen, watching his beautiful world being systematically destroyed. The floating cities were falling from the sky as their power sources were drained. The crystal gardens that had taken centuries to cultivate were being strip-mined by creatures that showed no appreciation for their beauty. Sir, his sensor operator called out, I am detecting new contacts approaching the system. The signatures are not Devourer vessels. Yelkoth turned his attention to the tactical display, where new symbols were appearing at the edge of the star system. The ships were moving at velocities that should have been impossible without destroying their crews through acceleration forces. As they drew closer, their designs became visible through long-range sensors. The vessels were human, but these were not the modest ships that humanity had operated during their Council membership. The flagship that led the formation was nearly twice the size of Admiral Thexara's command vessel, its hull incorporating design elements that seemed to flow like liquid metal. Energy readings from the human fleet showed power outputs that exceeded anything in Council military records. Admiral Chris Morgan's voice came through the communication channels with clarity that suggested transmission technology far beyond current Council capabilities. Governor Yelkoth, this is Admiral Morgan of the United Earth Federation. We are moving to assist your world. Admiral Morgan, Yelkoth replied, his crystalline voice resonating with desperate hope. Our defenses have failed. The Devourer fleet numbers in the thousands. Your ships are outnumbered by more than 50 to 1. Understood, Governor. Please instruct your remaining forces to withdraw to minimum safe distance. What happened next would be remembered as the Battle of Kethvar, though calling it a battle implied that the Devourers had some chance of victory. The human fleet moved through the enemy formation like sharks among minnows, their weapon systems demonstrating capabilities that redefined what space combat could achieve. The UES Determination, Admiral Morgan's flagship, fired kinetic barriers that could deflect the planet-cracking weapons that the Devourers used to break apart worlds. Energy cannons mounted on the human vessels discharged concentrated stellar plasma that could vaporize enemy ships in single shots. Most impressive of all were the fighter craft that moved through space as if they were living creatures, anticipating enemy movements and adapting their tactics in real time. Commander Beth Rodriguez led the ground assault that drove the Devourer invasion forces back from the planet's surface. Her troops wore power armor that made them nearly invulnerable to enemy weapons, while their firearms adapted automatically to counter any defense the biomechanical warriors could deploy. What should have been a desperate last stand became a systematic elimination of every Devourer presence on Kethvar. Governor Yelkoth watched the battle from his command center with growing amazement. The human forces were not simply defeating the Devourers. They were doing so with casual efficiency that suggested this level of enemy was no longer considered a serious threat. Within 18 standard hours, the Devourer fleet had been completely destroyed. Not a single enemy vessel escaped to carry word of their defeat to other Devourer swarms. The biomechanical warriors who had seemed unstoppable were eliminated so thoroughly that their remains would provide valuable research material for Council scientists. But the most shocking aspect of the battle was not the human victory itself, but the transformation that humanity had clearly undergone since their departure from Council space. These were not the same desperate species seeking acceptance that had joined the Council decades earlier. The humans moved with quiet confidence, spoke with absolute authority, and demonstrated casual mastery over technologies that the Council's greatest minds could not begin to comprehend. Captain Nick Thompson materialized in Governor Yelkoth's command center through a transportation system that violated several fundamental laws of physics. The human officer was tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His uniform incorporated materials that seemed to shift and adapt to environmental conditions, while the devices attached to his belt suggested access to technologies that bordered on the miraculous. "Governor Yelkoth," Captain Thompson said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through multiple dimensions of space. "Admiral Morgan sends his compliments. The immediate threat to your world has been eliminated." "Captain Thompson," Yelkoth replied, his crystalline body flickering with patterns that indicated profound gratitude. "Your arrival saved 3 billion lives. How can we possibly repay such a debt?" "No repayment is necessary," Thompson replied. "Protecting innocent populations from predatory species is simply the right thing to do." "But your technology, your capabilities," Yelkoth continued, "they exceed anything we thought possible. How has humanity advanced so far in such a short time?" Captain Thompson smiled, and for a moment his enhanced features showed something that might have been nostalgia. "We have been busy, Governor. During our time in the Council, we learned much about galactic civilization. But we also brought knowledge that your species were not yet ready to understand." "What kind of knowledge?" Yelkoth asked. "The kind that comes from thinking differently about fundamental problems," Thompson replied. "Your species focus on perfecting existing technologies. Humans focus on discovering entirely new approaches to old challenges." As Captain Thompson prepared to leave, he handed Governor Yelkoth a small device that looked like a crystal, but felt warm to the touch. "This communication relay will allow direct contact with human forces if you ever face similar threats. We may no longer be members of the Council, but we have not forgotten our obligations to civilized worlds." The device activated automatically, displaying a simple message that appeared in perfect Vrillan script. "When you are ready to learn, we will be ready to teach." After the human fleet departed, Governor Yelkoth stood in his rebuilt command center and looked out at his restored world. The crystal gardens were already beginning to regrow, aided by human technology that accelerated natural processes without disrupting ecological balance. The floating cities were being reconstructed using materials that were stronger and more beautiful than anything his people had previously created. But most importantly, a message was spreading throughout council space about what had happened at HFY. Humanity had returned, not as supplicants seeking membership, but as guardians with the power to reshape the galaxy according to their will. The news of humanity's victory at HFY spread through council space like wildfire, carried by traders, diplomats, and military officers who could barely believe what they were reporting. Within weeks, every major world in the galaxy knew that humans had single-handedly defeated a devourer swarm using technology that seemed to belong in science fiction rather than reality. Chairman Zekthor stood in his private chambers aboard the Council's primary space station, reviewing intelligence, reports that painted an increasingly impossible picture of human capabilities. His crystalline body refracted the chamber's lights in patterns that would have indicated severe distress to any member of his species who witnessed them. The reports were coming from dozens of sources throughout the galaxy, all telling variations of the same incredible story. Human ships were appearing wherever civilized worlds faced serious threats, providing assistance that went far beyond simple military intervention. They were rebuilding destroyed infrastructure overnight, healing environmental damage that should have taken centuries to repair, and sharing technologies that solved problems the Council had considered unsolvable. Dr. Veltara had been among the first alien scientists to receive direct contact from humanity's new civilization. Dr. Sam Collins, who had once been her research partner during the Council years, had returned to share discoveries that revolutionized everything she thought she knew about biology and medicine. Veltara, Dr. Collins had said during their reunion, "I want to show you what we learned after we left your space." The demonstration had been almost beyond comprehension. Dr. Collins had taken samples of diseased tissue from various species and repaired the genetic damage using techniques that seemed to operate at the quantum level. Cellular structures that had been considered irreparably damaged were restored to perfect health within minutes. The aging process itself could apparently be halted or reversed through methods that treated biological systems as programmable matter. "How is this possible?" Dr. Veltara had asked, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with amazement. "We developed consciousness transfer technology," Dr. Collins had explained. "Death became optional for our species 5 years ago. Disease was eliminated 3 years ago. We learned to treat biological systems as information that could be backed up, modified, and restored just like computer data." Engineer Maya Johnson had made similar contact with the industrial specialists who had once worked alongside human technicians. The Centaurian engineers who had dismissed human manufacturing techniques as primitive were now learning about matter conversion systems that could transform raw elements into finished products through controlled atomic manipulation. "During our time in the Council," Maya had explained to her former colleagues, "we were learning about your industrial processes while developing our own approaches to manufacturing. We discovered that most species think too small when it comes to production capabilities. The demonstration had involved the construction of a complete starship from basic materials in less than 6 hours. The humans had brought portable facilities that could break down matter at the molecular level and reassemble it according to precise specifications. What had once required massive shipyards and months of labor could now be accomplished anywhere with the right equipment." Professor Linda Barnes had returned to share advances in physics and energy production that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the universe operated. The Vrillan scientists who had once condescended to human researchers were now struggling to understand theories that treated space and time as malleable properties rather than fixed constants. "Your species focus on working within the laws of physics as you understand them," Professor Barnes had told a gathering of the galaxy's leading theoretical physicists. "We chose to expand our understanding until we found ways to work around those limitations. The energy systems that powered human technology drew power directly from the quantum foam that underlies reality itself. Transportation methods that had seemed impossible were actually applications of dimensional mathematics that treated distance as a variable rather than a constant. The construction projects that had been observed in deep space were built using techniques that manipulated matter and energy at scales that made traditional engineering obsolete. But perhaps the most profound change was in humanity itself. Ambassador. Kate Morrison returned to address the council chambers where she had once announced humanity's departure, but she was no longer the same person who had left 3 years earlier. Her appearance was still recognizably human, but her presence filled the vast chamber with an authority that made even Chairman Zekthor seem small by comparison. Honored delegates, she began, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions that most species could not perceive. We return to you not as petitioners seeking membership, but as neighbors offering partnership. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Every delegate present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would reshape galactic civilization. The species that had once dismissed humanity as too primitive for serious consideration were now looking up at a representative of what might be the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. During our time among you, we learned much about galactic politics and culture, Ambassador Morrison continued. But more importantly, we learned about the limitations that prevent most species from reaching their full potential. We discovered that advancement requires not just intelligence, but the willingness to abandon comfortable assumptions about what is possible. Chairman Zekthor found his voice with difficulty. Ambassador Morrison, what does humanity propose for the future of galactic civilization? We offer true partnership, she replied. Not the hierarchical relationships that have defined council politics, but collaboration between equals working toward common goals. We bring technologies that can eliminate scarcity, end disease, and open pathways to forms of existence that transcend the limitations of biological evolution. What would be required for such partnership? Asked the Corvani military representative, his reptilian voice showing none of its usual arrogance. The end of the old system, Ambassador Morrison replied simply. The council as currently structured is built on the assumption that some species are naturally superior to others. That assumption is false. Every species has unique capabilities that contribute to galactic civilization. What is needed is a framework that recognizes and develops those capabilities rather than suppressing them. The terms were presented with the quiet confidence of a species that no longer needed to negotiate from weakness. Humanity offered membership in a new galactic federation based on mutual respect and shared advancement. They would share their technologies freely with species that demonstrated commitment to peaceful development and cooperative exploration of the universe. The old council hierarchy would be dissolved. Political decisions would be made through consensus rather than domination. Economic systems would be restructured to eliminate scarcity and provide every citizen of every member species with access to resources needed for fulfillment and growth. Captain Steve Walker, now serving as humanity's chief diplomatic officer, watched from the observation deck as former council chairman Zekthor formally requested membership in the new human-led Galactic Federation. The same crystalline being who had once dismissed humanity as too emotional and unpredictable was now asking to be taught by the species he had once considered inferior. "Welcome," Walker said, his enhanced voice carrying warmth that transcended species boundaries, "to the future we built while you were not watching." The transformation was complete. Humanity had left council space as outcasts and returned as teachers. They had chosen transcendence over revenge, offering uplift to the same species that had rejected them. The galaxy would never be the same, and for the first time in generations that change promised hope rather than fear for every thinking being among the stars.